So good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all. Thank you so much for joining us today. I would like to say warm welcome. My name is Yelizaveta Diktirova, but you can just call me Lisa. I'm the co-founder of the 4D Sustainability Canvas, which is a simplified tool that we created with Luis Bertrami, who is helping today me in the webinar, just waiting. So it's a simplified tool for SMEs helping to implement sustainability in their business models and strategies. And we created this webinar series in order to provide practical measures on how companies, particularly SMEs, can rethink their business after pandemic. So the idea actually spun out of our original mission to demystify sustainability in the most practical way. So not just talking in superlatives, but giving some hands-on tools to companies in order to be able to start navigating on this sustainability journey. And one of those tools are that you can find on our website. Luis is going to pop it into the chat. And also these kind of webinars where we can discuss best practices and other insightful like ideas. Before I start today's topic, which is on diversity and inclusion from the racial perspective, I'd like to just share some housekeeping rules. So you all are joining in mute, and I would like to keep your mics on mute. This is a recorded event. I hope it's not a problem to anyone. We will have a Q&A in the end of the presentations and the discussions, but feel free to pop your questions into the chat section anytime. We will try to address all the questions, and thank you so much for all the questions that we received already. Actually, we try to align the content so you could get an answer to those, and some of them will be highlighted actually separately in the QA section as well. We're planning to hold this webinar for about an hour and a half, depending on the number of questions that we're going to receive. So another important thing that this is not just our first webinar, but it's also a special one because we're doing it under the initiative of Visions for Change, created by Amani Institute, which is a 4-month-long initiative providing learning, support, and networking opportunities. So you can visit their website. Luis is going to share also the link in the chat. So basically, today the aim of Amani's Visions of Change for Change initiative is to support organizations that help hard-hit communities in 4 continents. So you can visit their site, you can attend the events and donate to the organizations. And talking about donation, as part of this webinar, you also have a chance to contribute to the fight against racial inequity, as we are raising funds for Dos Offroadmundo from Afros to the World. It's a Brazilian NGO working on the integration of Black informal workers and Afro entrepreneurs into formal supply chains. We're going to hear about them more a little bit later, but in the meantime, feel free to visit their site and donate as much as you wish so or feel like. So to set the context of today's topic, there were the 2 recent events that ignited the issue of social and racial inequalities, which was certainly inherent in our system. systems and bred by our financial and economic system. And both the pandemic and police brutality, not only in the US, but even in, actually, it happens in bigger numbers in Brazil that little people talk about, have shed light on the systemic problems on marginalized communities. So we should recognize that many communities will remain vulnerable to not only to the pandemic, but climate change and all kinds of crises. And the pandemic already affected the poor communities in a disproportionate level, a majority of which is Black people. So obviously many of them would not have, they don't have the option to stay at home. They don't have, now they have reduced income, no sick leaves, no unemployment insurance, no healthcare in some countries. So there is an estimate that the global pandemic actually could increase global poverty by as much as 500 million people, like staggering numbers. And although we see a lot of movement and a lot of talk about from the World Economic Forum, from the European Union with the Green New Deal, that we should recover from this crisis greener, better, more equal, and have a just economic recovery. And some cities and some governments actually took some bold actions towards that. At the same time, it just feels like it doesn't really resonate to our level of small companies and business owners. So that's the reason we set up this webinar today as well, to share or to shed light on the importance of SMEs, small and medium businesses, in terms of their effect and impact on marginalized communities and the opportunities they can that grasp in order to create a more equitable world. So actually inclusive businesses play a key role in providing access to goods, services, and livelihoods for low-income and vulnerable people. And there is actually a business case behind it as well. So finding ways to tackle health deficiencies in poor labor forces, or developing products that raise the well-being of marginalized communities, can actually translate into saving costs, revenue growth, improved profitability, and also new business opportunities in general, new product lines, right? So before I introduce our guest speakers to you, I won't be talking all the time, I promise. I would like to, it might be actually, for most of you, and I know that many of you who joined today from different companies have already implemented efficient diversity measures and inclusive, like they work in more inclusive workplaces. But at the same time, I thought it would be nice to be on the same page about the relation between diversity and inclusion and what's the difference between the two. So I like to say that diversity is actually the final aim we're trying to achieve through inclusion, which is the means. So diversity is the representation of all our varied identities and differences, whether it comes to race, ethnicity, gender, disability, sexual orientation, gender identity, national origin, caste, social economic status, communication styles, learning background, collectively and as individuals as well. And it's really important that to highlight that is those who we call to be left out, they were not left out because they are different. They are left out because we, like mainly the privileged group, were committing injustices. So it's not because they are misfit or they are not as us, it's just simply because we created those systems. So I think it's really important to bring this reflection to our, when we talk about diversity in and in integrating different people in our organizations. And here I should also mention equity, which takes into consideration the barriers that some vulnerables or like different minorities have. And when we talk about inclusion, those barriers should be taken into account. So I think I'll just quickly now introduce, if you have any thoughts on this or disagreement on the way we see diversity and inclusion as a definition, feel free to put it in the chat as well. And I would like to introduce our lovely panelists. We have Marina Bradford joining us from the UK, London. She's a sustainability and procurement consultant, supporting development funds and corporates looking to enhance their impact. Then we have some Amani research fellows joining us from Dubai, Akash Chander, who is a Deloitte management consultant, Salma Moreira, she's the executive director of Baoba Racial Equity, and Jan Regate, who is the founder of Dos Offroadmundo and also a socio-racial innovator, and Julia Lansolo, who is a customer success. She's responsible for customer success at an ad tech company in Brazil. And her background is in public policy advice. So warm welcome to you all. So Salma, Jan, and Julia are joining us from Brazil, Akash from Dubai, and Marina from London. Just to, yes, and there's another thing I wanted to mention that Akash, Salma, and Jan, and Julia, they were part of the last Amman Institute like social innovation management cohort, and they ran a research that we're going to talk about, and they're going to present to us as part of this panel. So I'd like to turn to Marina first. I think it is useful to clarify what is diversities and the inclusion and the role of diversity and inclusion in sustainability. How does it relate to it?
Thank you very much, Lisa, and thank you for the introduction, and thank everyone for being here today. So from sustainability perspective, diversity and inclusion are quite crucial and critical. Diversity is all around us, so like Lisa has mentioned, there's lots of different dimensions to that, but that's what makes it exciting, that's what makes it beautiful, and that's what makes it curious. But it's also critical in complex problem solving, because we need diversity of thinking, we need different input. And if you think about sustainability perspective, these are very complex problems we are trying to solve at the moment that are really impactful for a number of different communities across the board. Minority communities or communities in other parts of the world that are significantly affected by climate change are affected disproportionately. So we really have to engage all of the different parts of the world and different representation to make sure we can solve the problems. The other important aspect of that is that there's obviously a business case for sustainability from the performance perspective. But if you think about climate change as a fight against injustice, climate injustice, and trying to dismantle the systems that have got us to this position, thinking about diversity and inclusive ways of problem solving is so crucial in making sure we can dismantle the social injustices and racial. If you think about sustainable development goals, quite a big chunk of those are actually focusing on people, communities, and those injustices that exist there. If you can't solve the social aspects of it, we can't really solve the climate component of it. So we really have to work with the people across the board to make sure we get the best of it.
Thank you. And I really like that you mentioned the business case behind diversity or diverse companies. And I know, because it bears opportunity and risk as well of, if companies don't achieve diverse teams. I know Akash has brought some interesting findings from a research to us about what opportunities and risks bear a company depending on the level of diversity it has.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa, and it's good to be here. Thank you all for joining. And Marina rightly shared that, there are these sustainability challenges that diversity and inclusion addresses, but even for businesses and for SMEs, this is an important element that can have an impact on your business as well. So what we found was that organizations that became more diverse and inclusive, they saw up to a 35% increase in their profits. And this went even further when they brought out more gender diversity, and they saw up to a further 15% increase in their profits. So there's some reasons for that. When organizations become more diverse, like Marina mentioned, we have better problem solving, better different perspectives coming in. And that leads to more creativity within the organization, which leads to better decision making, both from a strategic and more long-term perspective, but also in your day-to-day decision making. Then you also see improvements in customer service and sales, because when your teams are more diverse, you're able to also orient yourselves better to different groups of customers. So you actually are able to serve a wider variety of customers in a better way. So your sales also improve as an outcome. Then you also see your organizational performance improving when the whole people management side of things becomes more inclusive, and your HR practices, your talent development practices, they improve. Then people tend to be happier within organizations as well. And that leads to higher performing teams. And in addition to that, so that's the more individual side of it. But even in terms of the teams, we see that, when there is more inclusion in the organization, the way teams engage as well improves. And that's a result of there being lesser conflict and lesser prejudice within teams because of that inclusive culture. And that, along with that, kind of increases the organizational performance as a whole. And lastly, there is one that we all familiar with in some way, which is the public reputation. And organizations that actually demonstrate that they are diverse and inclusive, they see a stronger public image when they actually ingrain it within their organization and go beyond small initiatives or keeping it as a CSR initiative. So that improves their standing in the market, and in the long term can also change the way that they grow because of the public image that they have.
Thank you. I think it just sounds like it's not even an option, right? So it should be like a must for companies to be diverse.
Yeah, it's in today's world, especially with everything that has happened recently with Black Lives Matter and coronavirus and all of these events that have highlighted to us the social need for it. There's no better time now for businesses to marry that with the sort of business need that they're also facing right now with all the issues they've had over the last few months and staying afloat. It's a great time to kind of get these fundamentals in place. And what we also saw was organizations that have less diverse thinking in them, they actually face up to a 30% risk of not meeting their required outcomes, either from a strategic or a financial perspective, because they end up having narrow problem-solving skills because of the lack of diversity in thought. And actually, when we see diversity increasing, not only does this risk of not meeting your required outcomes get mitigated, but we also see that organizations go beyond that, and it actually leads to innovation. So we actually go into a surplus here, and it can lead to up to a 20% increase in innovation. And this, in the UK, for example, is estimated to be an opportunity of £24 billion. On a global level, you can imagine how much bigger it is. So for SMEs, that's a huge piece of the pie to kind of pick up. And this would be a great opportunity to kind of put some of these fundamentals in place and grab this opportunity.
Thank you. I think now everyone is curious how to leverage those £24 billion. But before we jump into the solution, I think it's crucial to understand the history and the background of inequality and why it exists at all, how racism shaped it actually. And for that, we have Salma and Julia here to present their research. They did the research exactly in this topic, but in a Brazilian context. So I believe the reason it's good for us to see in one country, because it would be the first step for any company or any organization to understand the local context. So first the problem, and then jumping into the solution and understanding the needs of the community. So turning to you, Salma, I was wondering if you could present a little bit the research and help us understand what have driven you to do it, and where did you get to?
Okay, thank you, Lisa. Thank you for the opportunity to be part of this meeting, to talk about Brazil and the challenge that we face to promote racial equity. So Brazil is one of the most inequitable countries in the world. And Afro-Brazilians are almost 56% of the population, and we're still being considered minority, but we are not. So according to our research, we identified that 70% of Brazilian population living in favelas. No, 7% of the population living in favelas are Afro-descendant, with limited access to basic rights, education, employment, and healthcare. 60% does not have income to sustain their families beyond 1 week. 8% of favela population has suffered income losses. It shows a lack of perspective on informal and formal jobs opportunities, especially in terms of gender and race. 75% is the difference between the average income within white and Black people. So it's an absurd. Summarizing, it is a huge lack of solutions in low-income communities. 30.5 million Brazilians living in extreme poverty, and 78% of these groups are Afro-Brazilian. So these inequities, of course, includes a lack of investment in social movements, job opportunities, but especially those investments to promote rights and racial justice. Initiatives like those Offroadmundo, with financial resources to build sustainable solutions. That is our point. So to explain that, we build a persona to show an example about what is being Black, and especially being a Black woman in Brazil. So here we have Rebecca. And Rebecca, I'm gonna tell you her story. And it represents a huge part of Black women in Brazil. So she had faced lots of barriers to finish high school and get into the university, but she did. She finished business and had good grades. With lots of effort, she started to work as an intern in a national company, but unfortunately, she was not hired as an employee when the agreement finished. So she keeps trying to find a formal job without success. The only way was she had to start an informal small business to survive. It's a picture about being Black in Brazil. The huge lack of opportunities, lots of barriers to keep doing and keep performance and doing their better. So that's is it for now.
Thank you. And I know that, Julia, if you could present us a little bit more about those barriers, those systemic barriers that actually Rebecca would face from her childhood.
Okay, Lisa. First of all, thank you for the opportunity to talk about such an important subject. And as Selma well mentioned before, Rebecca's journey started in education. So in our research, we wanted to find out, to understand why the gaps in education pushed people like Rebecca to the informal market. So first of all, we observed that the quality of public schools in Brazil can be unsatisfactory. And not always there are public policies that guarantee conditions for Black students to stay at school and complete their studies. And when we talk about public policies, we mean, for example, financial aid to high school students that accomplish a certain frequency at school and that have families with a per capita income that can be inferior to the minimum wage from the country. So when we look to this scenario, completing basic education can be a huge challenge because in families, there is an urge for this student to help the family financially. And this can lead to a huge gap between white and Black graduation rates, not only when we look to the school perspective, but also when we look to university perspective as well. And then we go to the formal sector gaps. I guess just, it's on the next slide.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, thanks. So besides that educational gaps, we noticed that in the Brazilian scenario, affirmative actions, sometimes they don't go beyond the educational field. So they stop in the educational field and they don't enter the formal sector field. So even hiring companies have diversity policies, it's still difficult to hire an equal number of Black workers and white workers. And this is reinforced by the fact that college education requirements often pose a barrier for Black workers, even that the candidates have the other skills that are required to the job. And at the end, this leads us to this tiny percentage you're seeing of Black leaders in management positions at the biggest Brazilian enterprises. So we still have a really small percentage of representation in the biggest and most important Brazilian enterprises. And then we go to the problem at the informal sector, which is the end of our analysis. So these obstacles that we mentioned that are faced in education and informal sector can lead a Black population to have informal work as their only option. And when you become an informal worker, you're still going to face several barriers that can make you earn less, as Selma mentioned in the beginning when she talked about the racial problem, like in the biggest spectrum in Brazil. So one of these variables that can make you earn less as a Black entrepreneur is the limited access to resources and supply chains, for example, due to the same racial biases that can lead 1/3 of Black informal workers to having their credit denied. We see this number is pretty shocking, but it's what's happening now. And considering coronavirus crisis, this is very worrying because I guess it's a moment where having access to credit is really important. So at the end, saturated by these damaging perceptions, we noticed in our research that only 9% of these workers end up seeing themselves as and recognizing themselves as entrepreneurs, you know?
So thank you, Julia. I think you probably managed to shock a lot of people from the audience now with these results. Unfortunately, this is the reality in Brazil, and this is the reality in many countries. Actually, these three barriers that you just presented represent perfectly what is structural racism, what is systemic racism, what is inherent in the system. So people don't have access to education and social security or financials, like financial help, like credit. I know in the UK, informal work is less of a, is less typical, but I was wondering, Marina, if you think in the UK context we can relate to these barriers that were just presented in Brazil, that economic community faces. Yeah.
Absolutely. Unfortunately, the story probably is similar, although it's going to have the contextual differences because racism and how the structural racism has evolved in different countries is very much dependent on the historical context and kind of the reasons that it shaped up the way it has. In the UK, I guess if you look at the educational perspective, Black Caribbean students are 3.5 times more likely to be excluded from school or be marked down by their own teachers, the ones who know them, when compared when their grades are marked by an external teacher who does not know the kid or doesn't see their name. It's actually the opposite trend for Indian and Chinese students, so they get to be marked up. So there is sort of that inherent bias around perception of ability and capability in educational system. If you look at the business context, the proportion of the non-white representation on management boards and senior positions across different industries is significantly lower than the proportion of those populations in the country. So I think it's about 4 to 5 times smaller as a percentage. And then obviously, if you look at the informal sector or SMEs really, or sort of access to capital challenges, again, that's very similar because the Black entrepreneurs or female entrepreneurs to start with, and then Black female entrepreneurs have significantly more challenges in accessing the funding that they might need for their startups, if you think about raising crowdfunding, VCs, etc. So there's definitely challenges. If you look at the UK context, there's an extra layer to that. So the class system has obviously added a different dimension to it. Class is quite a significant barrier in the UK. But essentially what that means that if you marry up race and class and gender challenges together, it means that individuals from various communities have little access to resources, networks, opportunities, access to any of those connections they may need to be successful in education or at work. And in fact, if you look at the results of the McGregor-Smith review, which was done by the UK government in 2017-2018, looking at those barriers and the challenges and possible solutions in context of the UK racism and D&I, 71% of survey respondents actually cited this lack of connection to the right people as a factor and not progressing at work. And I guess if you all think back as to how we have progressed in our work and our roles, you know, connections and that sort of networking opportunities always played quite significant. So if you don't have that access, it becomes a struggle. So in the UK, for example, Black applicants tend to go through agencies simply because this will be more comfortable and they will be looking for more opportunities that way.
So it looks like very similar, unfortunately, the picture. Okay, so jumping into the solution section now, and best practices. So we've seen big companies standing against racism, turning their profile pictures pitch black, and making audacious commitments. But I was wondering if what can be done more to shift from these symbols to more substance. Could you, Marina, like present us some of the best practices that you've seen during your career as part of your consulting work, and share with us?
Yep, sure. So I guess the starting point is a notion, sort of you need to be quite clear on definitions as Lisa have presented it to us, but we also need to have an understanding there's different facets. So there is structural racism and there's manifestations of that in different parts of our lives. So if you think about racism, it isn't just about feelings, it isn't just about the concept that none of us can influence. If you think of it as behaviors, we can actually start thinking about solutions. So Dr. Philip Atibagov, if you guys have a chance, watch his TED Talk, really interesting. He was doing work on racism, US police, and this is one of the ways of starting to think about. Firstly, it's a journey, and it's a journey we all need to be going on to. It's not really a destination sort of a project that is time bound. We can always do better, and therefore we need to start thinking about our own behaviors first, and start thinking what those behaviors might mean in terms of the experience of people towards whom we may be acting. So if you look at it in that context, and then move forward a little bit, next slide, the first starting point, maybe to actually start doing a bit of a reflection. So it's a reflection inwards. And if you think about an SME as a collection of individuals, and the company culture is essentially a collection and sum total of the beliefs, value systems, and behaviors of all individuals within that organization. The first thing we need to do is think about our own education and how much we understand the history and the context of racism in the countries that we all are from. So obviously you guys are from all different parts of the world. We need to understand our role in it. You know, if we are white, like I am myself, obviously then I need to make sure that I firstly learn and educate myself around what white privilege means and what sort of experiences people go through where they don't have white privilege, and vice versa. So if you don't see it, it doesn't mean it doesn't exist, and therefore we need to be quite clear about that. In an organizational context, that education needs to be also supported by the leadership of an SME, of any kind of business. And I always recommend sponsorship and championship, but championship being the most effective. So the senior leadership championship means they're not just lending their name to this initiative, not just putting this sort of signature underneath all of the announcements. They're actually thinking through it themselves. They reflect, they engage, they participate. One of the companies I worked for when we were setting up the D&I initiative, it was an international organization, the D&I partner was the person who would write his own messages. He had his personal stories he would share with everyone. He would attend every single event, and he would proactively go through reverse mentoring scheme that was introduced, because he wanted to first understand and share before he could actually then obviously, you know, ask anybody else to do the same. But if you start from that journey, the next thing what would be recommended is to have this difficult conversation within your organization. So within SME context, you need to have the conversation with your employees. Whatever the representation may be, however diverse the organization is, if you have different representation, it needs to be quite clear that there is open space and there is a safe space so people can share their experiences and you can actually understand what that looks like across the different dimensions. So whether it's to do with progression, whether it's with recruitment, you know, there's different kind of touch points around the challenges that might come up. And before you understand what your specific organizational challenges are, it's very hard to jump to action. So you need to make sure that you, before you start writing any policies, actions, or anything of that nature, you engage the people whose experience you're ultimately trying to improve. What you've seen in front of you is actually a real life case. It's an organization whose name I'm not going to bring up, but they've gone through this exercise. They've actually brought in expert consultants to have those discussions with their own staff to make sure that they have that understanding before they start making any decisions. And this was captured in a beautiful manner instead of this graphic recording. But what it demonstrates is that, you know, the solutions can then be collaboratively co-created with your employees, and that would be the starting point, to have that an ongoing conversation, which will be uncomfortable, but that's where you have to be. The other ideas that we can think about is collecting data. So diversity data is actually an important tool in seeing progress, because it may be challenging to figure out sort of, you know, what boxes or what categories there are, but it's important to make sure that you understand how reflective your organization is of the community within which you operate. And it's important to make sure that you can see the progress. And it's important to know that everybody is actually part of that. It's not just about the numbers, it's about inclusivity, but diversity metrics would be one way of making sure that you don't just bring people through the door, but they actually stay as well because they feel comfortable as being part of this organization. Reflecting on organizational image in messaging is quite key. You can't become what you can't see. So if I look at your website, or if I look at your marketing messages, or if I look at any of the events that you may be putting up, whether it's recruitment or promotional, what kind of people will I see? So if it's the Black people, will they see somebody who looks like them? If it's people from any other groups, will they be able to feel like they can belong here? One of the most critical thing, obviously, is to make sure that you put resources behind your intent and your messages. So if you're standing up for anti-racism, and if you are proactively being anti-racist, you need to put the money behind your intent, and you can do it in multiple ways. You can support organizations that are fighting inequality. So there are numbers of those in different countries, and we obviously have one of them today with us on the webinar. you can spend the money that you do as a business with impact. So you can buy from the BME suppliers, or you can buy from any other diverse groups. And that way you actually bringing them into the supply chain. You can still do that in a way that would be competitive. This is not just about donations. This is about allowing participation and allowing the diverse supply chains, and seeking that proactively, because this is where the intention has to become reality. And one of the other things that you could do, and obviously not many SMEs probably may be in a position to do that, but it's really powerful, is to stand up for your values, even with your clients and partners. So if you have a client that you now know, or somehow have come to know, don't share the values, so maybe you haven't quite agreed with the messaging they have been putting out or actions they have had, stop working with them. There's been a really powerful example that I've seen on Instagram in the last couple of days. A really lovely small stationery business have put out the message that actually stopped working with one of the really famous retailers, because they have learned about the practices, that the racist practices that retailer is implementing and has not changed, even though they have come to the surface. So they've made a challenging decision. They've decided to stop working with them because that was what's important. And this essentially is what anti-racism is about. We have to be active, we have to be proactive, and we have to speak on it.
Yeah, and thank you, Marina. It sounds like it's a sacrifice for this company who gave up on, you know, on an important partner or client. But at the same time, I don't think, I don't share that it should, like, necessarily should be a loss for them. Because on the other hand, you gain new market, like you gain new type of clients, likely, and actually that's going to represent a more inclusive value chain for you. So
absolutely. It can be an opportunity.
Yeah, thank you for sharing this. So we're going to share a lot of these best practices, useful links, resources, how you can actually run the conversation within your organization, the team, etc. After the webinar. I think it's likely going to be sent tomorrow. So we're not going to mention all of them, but I know, I think, Julia, you had a good example on, for example, like on a measure that worked, that you saw in your professional life, that fostered inclusion within an organization. Could you tell us more about it?
Yes, I guess one thing is interesting to say is that when we talk about this kind of changes, sometimes it doesn't have to be like something huge, you know, and this example I'm going to bring up is something that is small and that caused a great impact. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Vetor Brasil. I'm going to send the link on the chat later, but it is a nonprofit organization from Brazil that was created to recruit and qualify young professionals to work in projects in state and municipal governments in Brazil. So in their selective process, English tests would be one of the first steps from the selection process. But at the end, if you pass the process, you are going to work in organizations in municipal or government or state governments from Brazil. So rarely you are going to use English on your daily job, right? So one thing they observed is that this English test was letting a lot of people that had the other skills required outside of the selection process. And that English was not something really important to work at the government, at the Brazilian government. So they just let it out from the process. They got it out from the process, removed it. And they noticed that after this change, they had a more diverse panel of people participating from the selection process, and also then a more diverse panel of trainees that were hired by the governments after. So it's like, it's a small change, but they said, why are we still using this requirement? Just because it's a traditional requirement for each and every job in the world, but it didn't make sense in that context. So it was a small change that made the selection process and the trainee hiring more diverse.
And that's a great example of utilizing what we've always done, and therefore limiting the opportunities for people who actually can bring value without necessarily, you know, you kind of need to think about those entries. Similar example in the UK is EY, one of the accountancy firms. They have removed the requirement for a degree for their graduate program, because the skills that they were looking for actually did not necessarily have to come from a degree educated individuals, and that opened up doors to quite a lot of people with talents they wouldn't have had otherwise. So just some examples of other ways, which are sort of specific organizations that can actually do. Blind CV screening is a very good technique. So if you remove the name from the CVs, that helps just look at the qualifications and removes the risk of the unconscious bias. And a lot of studies and research has been done around its effectiveness, and it has worked. If you don't know who the person is, we actually judge them very differently. Links to the example I gave previously about education. Having diversity targets in shortlisting, again, not just for the sake of the targets, but being reflective of the community within which you operate. And this also has proven quite successful. There's an example in football, if any of you are fans. There's been an introduction of a Rooney Law, which basically meant that there has to be diversity target on the shortlist of the applicants for the coach position. And that essentially allowed more people of color to be considered for the positions. And then therefore, there's been an increase in diversity of the coaches that eventually got the job. There's going to be other examples that you can also look at, but you probably can have a look at it. So I think, Luis, if you show us the next part of it, various examples around staff experience, you may sort of questions you may want to ask.
Thank you. As I mentioned, we're going to share these tips later. And I would like to jump into a little bit to mention actually our canvas that you can download on from our website, which is called the 4D Sustainability Canvas. And in the context of diversity and inclusion, it contains some of the questions that can help an organization understand its impact in the 4 areas as we identified of sustainability. So it is not limited only to diversity. So we try to cover all sorts of, all the areas of sustainability, but it has been proven that companies got a better idea of their impact in these areas and understand where they can act next. Or what are the areas they should action on. So for example, just to bring some examples, when we talk about community, we ask a question about how does your company contribute to local communities where it operates. So that means that you can include your communities, maybe even marginalized and the vulnerable communities in your value chain, or talking about employees, looking at like the first step is really seeing the analysis of the team, so of the organization. So looking at how diverse is your company, why is it not, and look for answers when it comes to that. Obviously, when governance, like what kind of policies you have in place that promotes inclusion or a better workplace for all, considering those barriers that were mentioned before. Or how much the organization is committed to responsible sourcing when it comes to the planet section, so anti-slavery and fair trade movement. So yeah, you can go to our website and download the canvas, which is a first step of a three-step framework. Yeah, we're going to share this. Louis is going to share the link in the chat as well. But going, so we have also the don't do's, right? So Marina, I'd like to just go through quickly also those pitfalls that companies can fall into. So what is to avoid, and what is it that as I opened this topic before, we've seen a lot.
Yeah, so performative activism, I believe, is what you're referring to. So all of the black squares we have seen, which if you guys actually read up into what black squares originally meant, they didn't actually mean exactly what ended up happening. The initiative was quite different purpose, but a lot of organizations have sort of jumped on it, and it became performative activism. So it basically became something that companies did on 1 or 2 days in that year, But actually, if you look at what they did before and whether any actions were taken a week after that, you probably wouldn't quite find the same thing, the same level of activity. So being authentic is quite important. So less helpful is not being authentic, but just being seen to say the right thing. It's more important to do the right thing. In a similar vein, outsourcing your D&I activities to marketing is also probably not something going to help you change culture or address the challenges. So if the only diversity you're seeing is on the marketing posters, but actually people who work within your organization don't feel like they can be themselves within the organization, don't feel there is enough inclusion, or don't feel like they've actually been given fair opportunities, those marketing posters become tokenism, and that's actually quite harmful. Diversity and inclusion initiatives without the budget or voice is quite a big one. And again, that's probably can be seen quite a lot of number of different organizations. So one recent example I have seen of this, one of the accountancy bodies, so it's a professional body which is quite well known in the UK and actually internationally, they wanted to put out a D&I statement about the work that they're doing in the space, and they have asked representatives of their committee to do that on their behalf. And the people who did it were actually 20% who represented minority on the community. They were Black representatives. They wrote the statement and they gave it to the white part of that committee, who then rewrote it completely, softened up the language and changed it from the original message. So this would be an example of not to do, because what's important is actually hear the voice. It's not just enough to have the people who look different on your board. You need to listen to what they're saying and take that into account. The specific example that I have just brought up, the conversations took place a couple more times and the message was not diluted in the end, but it was a struggle, and that's a struggle that should not really exist. Similarly, if you have a D&I initiative, they need to have a budget, because you don't want them just to be there for the sake of it. The action requires resources, as we talked about earlier. Treating all BAME as a monolith. Now, BAME may be a term we use in the UK, so British and Asian minority, ethnic minorities. This may mean different things in different organizations, but essentially treating different diverse groups as a one, and like every single Black person experiences the same thing as the other Black person, again, is not really helpful. We need to be seeing people for people. We need to be seeing their own experiences for their own experiences, and that's where the beauty of diversity comes in. Building on that, intersectionality. So we talked about Black female having very different experience than just any other Black man, for example. And when you start layering female, disability, origin, race, class, any of that sort of thing, that becomes a challenge in itself and a very different story. Again, we need to be listening to those compounded stories and not just seeing them through a lens of what we think a group should be experiencing. And the final one is, don't focus on policy and compliance, focus on actual action. So you may have a very good policy and it may be very, very well written, but if there is no action, change, or any kind of self-reflection and move towards better, that's not really, really meaningful. So policy is useful, compliance is essential, but as one of the components, as you have seen, you need to think holistically and think about the people and the action first. Hopefully that's going to give some help.
Thank you, definitely. I guess it is all down to what we discussed before about values, you know, aligning the company with its true values and being authentic about what you're doing. So it's not enough to commit, but how you act on it is the main part. Yeah, so I will, so we will share this. One thing that companies actually can do, and that you also mentioned, Marina, like supporting organizations that have been already doing this kind of job for maybe decades. So there are like amazing grassroots organizations, community organizations that have been doing a lot against racism and discriminations in Black communities. And one of the way of contributing actually is donating or partnering up with these kind of organizations, or integrating these organizations into value chains or supply chains. So we going to hear now, I'm going to ask a little bit about Dos Afros Pro Mundo that we're raising funds for, because this is one of the actions you can take as well, regardless where you are in the world. And actually, as a takeaway, I think is that you can always look out for organizations that have been doing this kind of job in your region. But I'm turning to Jan now, because he was the amazing person who founded Dos Afros Pro Mundo, is from Afros to the World in English. So I'd like to, I think you will share now your screen, right, to present a little bit about how did you come to found this organization, and what is the main aim of it? A little bit, if you can tell us about the programs that that you're planning to launch.
Thank you, Lisa, for the opportunity to show everyone a little bit of our effort here in Brazil. As you could see, I guess it was very shocking for many of you, the reality of Brazil and the Black community here. And because of that, we have to think in solutions. And based on our research, on our group, on the Amman Institute, I saw a lack, and because of that, this project was born. So Dos Afros Pro Mundo, from Afros to the World in English, we are a support network for the promotion of racial equality with a focus on communication and professionalization of the Black community. Its main objective is to give visibility and support to Black informal works and Black entrepreneurs, creating connections with innovative people, companies, and organizations that contribute to combat social and racial inequalities. So this social action, it's about to develop the Afro entrepreneur with the purpose to help them in the recovery of small business in the peripheries, in the slums, favelas of São Paulo. So we will work based on three pillars: education, innovation, and well-being, promoting a series of activities to strengthen the ecosystem with useful, practical knowledge and giving access to the market.
So yeah, so could you tell us a little bit more about the program itself? I know it has several steps in it. So how you, where are you intervening, and yeah, in these entrepreneurs' life?
Okay, so we divide this social action in two steps. So the first step is in order to offer practical and useful content to the entrepreneurs day to day. We will bring together professionals and experts from different areas to produce an online course with a focus on bringing types and knowledge that help to remedy the main pains of Black entrepreneurs, serving as a guide for disruption about the coronavirus. And our target public is informal works and Black entrepreneurs.
Okay, and what about the next steps? So you provide the online courses, and as if I remember well, then you already started those online courses, right?
Yeah, in this month, in July, we are already record this course. Mm-hmm. So the course will be divided into short videos that will be sent periodically to the participants, to the entrepreneurs, Black informal works. And to ensure learning, we will do daily monitoring through a messaging application in order to answer questions and check the progress through a simple questionnaire. So everyone who participates until the end will win a gift and will participate in our upcoming projects. So we are going to talk about financial management, sales, digital marketing, product presentation, customer relationship. So we are gonna attack on the main pain of these black words.
Yeah.
So
will be after they have the knowledge.
yeah, so we are going to provide income to the expert. This is why we are going to we are doing this fundraise. So the expert will produce the contents online to give them to the entrepreneur, our entrepreneur. So.
And then, yeah, if you could tell us a bit more about the how are you going to help with marketing the products of these entrepreneurs?
So there is a second step. It's about the commercialization of this product. So after the online course, after this formation, we are going to give an opportunity to sell this product. This is a very important step. Empty store may become stores full of hope. Because why that? Usually when a store closes in a mall, there is a waiting period for another shopkeeper to occupy. But what about the store is empty? Have you ever imagined how many possibilities and dreams could fill that place? So we are talking with shop malls, managers of these malls to occupy this empty store.
Nice.
So we are going to do a curadory and select these entrepreneurs that has completely the formation for. So we are going to provide all the stuff they need to sell this product. And because the coronavirus, we are going to sell for them this product on this store and give the money for them of these sales.
Such a creative way of finding places, isn't it? Like no one thought about it. I think that, yeah, those just to kind of how to utilize empty spaces, right? Nice.
And we have a upcoming project. And after this social action, we are constructing a platform between professionals and small entrepreneurs to continue this project and to continue help them.
Lovely. Thank you.
Yeah, if you want to learn more, you can access our website.
Yeah, it's both in English and in Portuguese, and you can. Yeah, I encourage everyone to donate because the more money they receive, the more obviously beneficiaries they can reach. So it's straightly goes to the financing, actually paying those consultants who will be like the professors who will be teaching these entrepreneurs, for example.
So if I can just say something there. So for businesses, I mean, donating to things like this is obviously a great way, but also looking to partner with these kind of organizations and looking to partner with these kind of entrepreneurs and workers who may be skilled in different ways in these communities that are of a particular race or of a particular class. Like for example, in India, there's this company that I just thought of, I thought I'll share it with you all, called Jaipur Rugs. So they could have gone the traditional way and they could have just sold rugs through a factory, typical supply chain, sold it abroad. But they found that there are these communities of poor women in Jaipur, in India, who are very specialized in making rugs. And they are quite a marginalized community over there. from a class perspective. And they found a way to kind of incorporate those women into their supply chain and source their carpets from these women. So they gave them resources, they gave them access to a market, and in the process, they not only raised the livelihood of these women, but they were also able to sell very specialized rugs around the world. And they've become quite a large organization now. And they've positioned themselves as an organization that has a social mission and also is producing specialized products as well.
Oh,
So something for all of us to think about, how do we also incorporate these communities into our supply chains, because both parties have a lot to gain from that.
Yeah, thank you for this addition. It's actually it's the definition of social enterprises, right? So like how you rethink actually the mission of the business, which is beyond profit, should be something more, like I would say, like with more conscious, yeah. So thank you so much, Jan, for presenting this amazing project of yours. And thank you for what you've been doing. It's of crucial importance. Now we arrive to the Q&A section. So feel free to raise your hands if you have any questions. Yeah, you can. We can also unmute you. So if you want to introduce yourself and ask a question, then we will try to answer. Otherwise, I can also bring some questions that we received beforehand. And feel free also to put it into the chat. If there's nothing, then I will start. So actually, one of the questions that we received was, so that what have we seen that worked in terms of overcoming barriers when it comes to creating inclusive companies. I don't know if any one of you can actually, I'm asking this from the audience as well. So from your professional like experience, did you face any barriers when it came to, okay, let's talk about racism or discrimination or even like the diversity?
May I give some contributions?
Sure.
Because we also have some questions here in the chat about why it's so hard to get a job for Rebecca.
Yeah.
So I think we can put it all together and try
Yeah.
to address it.
Right.
Okay. So, so being Black, it's hard, not just here in Brazil, in the world. I think Brazil, we will have something special that we usually say that we have a racial democracy. So it makes more hard to address the problem, because when we do not see the problem, we cannot make efforts to go beyond it. So when we are talking about racism, diversity, inclusion, so in general, and I put something special here in terms of racial issues, because now we are all talking about Black Lives Matter. So let's make our position in our social media. Mm-hmm. And I think when we're talking about barriers and how to go through it, we need to be more than nice and make nice posts in our social media. We need to go through our strategy as companies and also as person, because in the end of the day, we have someone making decisions. So we need to review our behavior and address efforts to make difference in our personal life, but especially when we are taking decision in company, as when we are hiring someone, when we are trying to develop someone, giving real opportunities, talking about affirmative actions, because as Julia gave us an example, sometimes language here in our case, it's a barrier. So what can we do to give a real chance to have more Black people in your team, in your supply chain, and also in your social responsibility actions, making some philanthropic investments. So it's not about just one point. We need to look at it holistically in order to have Black people find opportunities to be part of the total pie, not just in a piece, because here it's your place, so be here. That's why we are trying to change. So
Thank you.
Thank you.
No, go ahead if there's something that you wanted to.
No, I was just going to finalize saying that that's the hard about the racism and the structural racism, because they build some kind of hierarchy between person, and they put some people, especially here in Brazil, when we saw the pyramid of privileges here in the base, that we have Black, human, and also LGBT, Q, I missed the last part, but you know, here, and then we have Black woman, and then have Black men. So how can we review that sense? Because it doesn't make any sense, especially here in a country when we are the majority, but not in terms of occupying place in companies and government and leadership positions. So that's where we are trying to review.
It's crazy that they call it in Brazil minority, right? Like it's just like completely the opposite.
Doesn't make any sense.
Doesn't make sense. And I think in terms of barriers, it could be also, I think just starting the conversation, like especially with people who don't have that, you know, I don't know, like some vision or knowledge about things about exactly the language, the problems, or acknowledging that there is a problem. I think it's like starting that conversation from acknowledging that actually this is racism is our system today. You know, like the white privileges was like built on, like, you know, on exploitation. So I think until people understand it, it's really hard to start the conversation. I think, I don't, if you have, if you don't have other questions, I think there was another interesting question that I would like to bring in, which is about how do we remove the subjectivity of racism within business to provide real agency for positive change to prosper. So I will share in that article, in that file that has all the resources, a really interesting article about that racism is being the system, the power, and it is about power and profit that was creating it. But I don't know if anyone has any other idea how we could remove subjectivity, that this is not racism, or, you know, like, I think it's all down to education in general.
Yeah, I think if I can come in here, there's probably different ways of defining sort of subjectivity, but like you said, education and familiarity are probably two key things, because what's often happens is it's the notion of otherness, and the minute there is a way of dividing people in other and not knowing what the other is, then there's become this of a stereotyping comes of the barriers that coming in. So awareness, sort of education is a starting point, like you said, sort of whether it's white privilege, whether it's historical context, whether it's understanding the experiences that different people go across. But the key thing is also actually creation that sort of interactions, of networks, of familiarity, learning about the other groups, traditions, cultures, you know, experiences, whatever that may be. So wherever there have been examples of sort of mixing people together in various settings, whether it's business, whether it's social, and just kind of learning about one another, what people tend to find out is actually we are more similar than we are alike. Mm-hmm. But until that familiarity comes in, it's very much down to sort of the language and terminology, and then drives certain perceptions. So I think to the point that Selma you made around minority versus majority, even though Black people are a majority in the country, if you say it's a minority, then the perception becomes very different, and therefore the treatment becomes very different. Mm-hmm. And not many people are going to go and look into the stats and actually figure out whether it's majority, minority, so then that language drives a lot of action. Mm-hmm. And I think until people kind of just know each other and know, you know, what everybody brings to the table and enjoys that culture, enjoys the different, you know, variety that it brings, the language can become divisive. So I think we just need to all make an effort as individuals to get to know others around us who may have grown up in different circumstances. But as organizations, I think fostering that network and celebrating diversity, that's what actually has, you know, demonstrated creating a cohesive team. So acknowledging different festivities, acknowledging different customs, different traditions, different ways of dressing, working, talking, whatever that may be, but acknowledging, creating space creates a stronger social fabric.
That was a nice closure.
I tried.
And actually, yeah, so I'm happy to like close here if there's no one else jumping in with questions, but either way, you can always write us. We're going to share our contact details, also the contact to our panelists, so you can also write them anytime with if you have further questions. So I would like to thank you all. I would like to thank our wonderful panelists to bring themselves today and for the work they've been doing. And I think they also highlighted the importance of recognizing that key issues like inequality and climate change can only backlash on the success of and on business opportunities. And actually small SMEs have the power and the chance to build a healthier society. And I'd like to close with a quote that you need to use our privilege to disrupt the privilege itself. So it's in our means of white privileged people to do that. So yeah, just thank you all. I wish you a lovely rest of the day or evening. And I'll be in touch soon with the links and bios and the follow-up email.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you all.